We just can't seem to leave Jane Austen and the Brontë sisters alone. Another Jane Eyre adaptation just been announced. We've just had another Wuthering Heights. We have another Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility coming later this year. The obvious question is why, but I think the more interesting question is how do these stories survive being reshaped and retold time and time again? So let's get into that. But before that, hello, my name is Cassidy Krieger from Hollywoodland Photos, and if you're new here, welcome. I love to explore everything that is old Hollywood, period drama, literary adaptations, and everything in between. So if you like that sort of stuff too, I would love for you to subscribe and stick around for more. So, and for the people that have made fun of my accent in previous videos, yes, I am Australian, and yes, I sound it. So apologies in advance if you can't understand an Australian woman speaking. But let's start with Jane Austen, because you only have to look at the numbers to understand what we're dealing with here. Okay, so let's go through this. There have been at least 7 screen adaptations of Sense and Sensibility, over 17 of Pride and Prejudice, more than 10 of Emma, and then multiple versions of Persuasion and Mansfield Park. That kind of repetition would normally exhaust a story, but instead they kind of keep regenerating themselves. But truly, I think to understand the magnitude of Jane Austen, we obviously need to look at Pride and Prejudice specifically. The 1940 adaptation of Pride and Prejudice with Laurence Olivier as Mr. Darcy and Greig Arson as Elizabeth Bennet relocates the novel visually into a kind of Hollywood Regency fantasy. The costumes are more Victorian than Georgian, and I think I read somewhere that they were trying to lean off the success of Gone with the Wind and kind of lean into that era. I could be wrong, but I think I'm right. The tone softens the social satire and leans into romance. It's glossy, it's studio-shaped, perfect for a 1940s audience. And then we kind of have a couple of decades where there's different adaptations, but there's nothing really major until the 1995 BBC adaptation. Need I say more? Colin Firth's Mr. Darcy became definitive for a generation, and Jennifer Eel was his Elizabeth Bennet. And with 6 hours given to it, it was a 6-episode series. This version restores social awkwardness because it's allowed to give time to discomfort. It trusts the stillness. It trusts the words. It allows tension to accumulate over hours. And then 10 years later, only 10 years later, we have Matthew Macfadyen stepping into the well-worn Mr. Darcy breeches with Keira Knightley as Elizabeth Bennet. Her Elizabeth feels more modern in cadence. The Bennet family feels less polished, more rural, and more kind of embodied, I guess, to the story. The camera moves closer and the emotion feels more immediate. So we have the same novel, 3 completely different tonal worlds, and yet the central arc remains stable. The dynamic never ages. And at this point, if Jane Austen were fragile, 17 adaptations of Pride and Prejudice would have diluted by now. Instead, each version reveals something completely different and at a slightly different pressure point. The 1940 film emphasizes charm. The 1995 series emphasizes restraint. The 2005 film emphasizes intimacy. And what will the 2026 adaptation emphasize? I can't wait to see, because the novel can take it. You can soften it, you can sharpen it, you can film it as a romance or as completely restrained, and yet Jane Austen still stands. And if Jane Austen proves flexibility, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre proves endurance. And to prove that, let's just look at the adaptations, because there have been over 30 since 1910. 30! That is insane. That shocks me, because I thought Pride and Prejudice would have outbeaten Jane Eyre by a long run, but no. So because there's 30, we can't look at them all. So let's focus on the main ones though, because the 1943 adaptation of Jane Eyre with Joan Fontaine as Jane Eyre leans into gothic grandeur. Orson Welles' Mr. Rochester is imposing and theatrical. And I love this adaptation for many, many reasons. It's just so beautiful to look at. And it's like this Wuthering Heights. It just speaks to me. But probably my favorite adaptation of Jane Eyre is the 2006 BBC adaptation with Ruth Wilson as Jane Eyre and Toby Stephens as Mr. Rochester, because it shifts the tone and restores the sensual tension. Then we go to the 2011 Jane Eyre with Michael Fassbender as Mr. Rochester, and it fragments the timeline and leans into more psychological restraint. The tone is quieter, more interior, and more isolated. So again, like with Pride and Prejudice, we have different decades, different tonal priorities, but for this particular story, one thing never disappears. Jane's refusal to compromise her moral integrity, her insistence on equality, her decision to leave rather than become Rochester's mistress. If you take away Jane's autonomy, the whole thing falls apart. You can darken it, you can romanticize Mr. Rochester, you can make it sensual, you can make it restrained. But if Jane doesn't leave, it isn't Jane Eyre. And then, of course, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights is so much more resistant to film than Jane Austen. We've discussed this time and time again. If you want to watch my reviews on the new 2026 adaptation or every adaptation of Wuthering Heights, major adaptation of Wuthering Heights for screen, I'll pop it where you pop things. But Wuthering Heights, as I have well discussed, doesn't bend easily for the screen. And if we start with the 1939 adaptation of Wuthering Heights, with Laurence Olivier as Heathcliff and Mel Oberon as Cathy, it removes the entire second half of the novel. That should weaken the story, but it doesn't. The obsession survives the edit. Heathcliff's fixation, Cathy's refusal to choose cleanly, the sense of emotional extremity is still there. So even when the second half is cut, the central intensity survives, even though I totally believe you must have the second half to tell the story in full. Somehow the story that Emily Brontë wrote still survives enough to be a really successful adaptation. Now, if we look at the 2026 adaptation that's just come out with Margot Robbie as Cathy and Jacob Elordi as Heathcliff, it strips the story down to its physical realism, sexual tension brought forward rather than implied. It emphasises physicality. But Brontë did build a novel on repression, on what cannot be resolved. When repression is surfaced to literally, the psychological pressure changes, and that's part of why that film, to me, wasn't fully Wuthering Heights. But yet, even then, the obsessive core that Emily Brontë wrote refuses to disappear. Heathcliff still cannot detach. Cathy still refuses equilibrium. The emotional violence still reverberates. Yes, the structure is altered. Yes, the second generation is gone. Yes, the emphasis changes. The tone hardens. But the underlying engine of this story remains. That's not defense of any adaptation. It's evidence of this novel, of its durability. So if we look at the reality of this, because there have been a million great books written since the dawn of time, and yet the studios keep coming back to the Brontës and Jane Austen. And I think it's because, quite simply, Hollywood and the studios recognize and understand recognizability. These are novels and names that you instantly recognize. And in the streaming era, when there is so much for us to watch, we are bombarded with content. Familiarity reduces risk. Period drama feels elevated in a sea of algorithm-driven content, but that alone doesn't explain the repetition, because there are plenty of 19th century novels and we don't keep cycling through them. What's interesting is that right now, period romance itself is thriving. You just have to look at Bridgerton. It is a global smash. Everywhere online, whenever I get on the apps at the moment, I'm bombarded with Bridgerton. But the thing about Bridgerton is that it leans into spectacle. It leans into sensuality. It's heightened emotional drama. It takes the social marriage market and amplifies the erotic charge. Audiences clearly want romance in corsets. They want longing, but they also want it surfaced. And that tells us something and might explain why the latest Wuthering Heights is so sensual. And as a society, we're nostalgic for structure, but less patient with repression. And that's where this obsession and love for Jane Austen and the Brontës becomes fascinating, because they were built on restraint, on what isn't said, on what cannot be acted on tension sustained rather than released. Modern adaptations do bring that, well, some bring that tension forward, literalize it, accelerate it. Sometimes that works, sometimes it flattens something, which is my view on the latest Wuthering Heights. I keep going back to that, I'm so sorry. But the fact is the audiences still respond and they still keep showing up for the new versions, and money talks. This suggests the foundation of these stories remains compelling. Recognition gets people through the doors, but structure keeps them watching. So why do I think every one of these stories keeps surviving each reinterpretation? Because quite simply, they were built to. Every generation rewrites Jane Austen and the Brontës. We change the tone, we move the camera closer, we surface what they kept restrained, we change the novels to suit what is happening in our world as we see it right now. And they don't disappear. The stories are so strong that they absorb the reinterpretation and they keep functioning. Because at the base of these novels are really well-written stories about things that we today can still relate to. Love, obsession, money, fear, family. It's all there. And when you put it on screen, we can still look at it and feel like we relate to Elizabeth Bennet. We relate to Jane Eyre. We relate to Mr. Darcy. And that's why I think we're still here all these years later. Why I think the new Pride and Prejudice, the new Sense and Sensibility will be hugely successful. The new Jane Eyre will be a smash hit. Why the new Wuthering Heights is raking in millions at the box office. And that's why I think we'll keep coming back to these stories for centuries to come.